Ew. Been doing a bit of decorating today. Uh, so I'm just going to take 10-15 minutes out to read again uh, from another book that I recently picked up by an author, a very famous author. Very famous man, actually. Uh, who lived throughout last century, 20th century. War correspondent, journalist, war correspondent, writer, uh, globetrotter, you know, a man who stayed very true to himself. And I think, I don't know if I'm struggling to remember it or not, a quote of his. Uh, I think it went something like this: that the people who bear themselves to the world, you know, often mocked, you know, often and often destroyed, you know, something like that. And I think that that reflects the nature of this man I'm going to speak about, Ernest Hemingway. Uh, Another person I greatly admire, not just as a writer but as a human being, you know. What can you say about this man, really? Fascinating man, led a fascinating life. Many people may come to feel that his end was a sad one, which I won't speak about here because I don't want to speak about that, because I don't really think it was a sad one. He came to end of his life and he was living in a lot of pain, this man, physical pain. He'd lived a full life, this this man had, and you know, in his writing, you know, I picked up this book recently. I read some Ernest Hemingway a few years ago, and when I was younger, but it didn't sink into me when I was a younger man. He's a very, you know, within his writing, he reflects a patience in his writing that's just so, you know, meaningful. It allows you to accept the majesty of what he's writing about. This man, the way he interprets nature, particularly nature, it's absolutely unbelievable, you know. I mean, his short stories, many of his short stories, he was famous for writing very famous novels, some of the most famous novels that there's ever been, you know. You will generally find some of his novels in 100 greatest books ever written, For Whom the Bell Tolls, you know, The Old Man and the Sea, you know, a fantastic writer. But when I read his short stories and his reflections on nature and also aesthetic world, you know, he uh, he he was a war correspondent in Spain during Spanish Civil War. Then China, World War Two really started in 1933, didn't it? When Japanese invaded Manchuria, and you know, it kicked off. I forgot what it was, but there was an altercation at a bridge. Japanese staged it, didn't they? You know, so war in China were raging from 1933 with Japanese, and it didn't, you know, start in Europe till 1939, and then it engulfed the rest of the world in 1941. And he served in World War Two as well, as a war correspondent. Many famous field commanders, General Patton, you know, Bradley, General Bradley, uh, Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, Field Marshal Montgomery. Well, I met all these people. He was such a well-respected war correspondent and writer, and he were a man's man. This man were a man's man, you know. The only way I can describe his writing when it comes to reflecting on the world around him, particularly natural world, is like looking through a microscope, a lens. You know, the detail, but the patience in his writing and how he allows you to explore, you know, the imagery of his words. It's just an absolute wonderful writer. You know, I'm nearly so emotional talking about him because he's such an important literary figure, and he's such an important writer. You know, it has come to be to me. You know, this is going to be a book I'm going to pick up quite often, and I'm going to read a story from you for you without rambling on too much. And this is what I really like, and I just think it reflects the majesty of his writing. So yeah, I'll take it out of this sleeve. This book. Yeah, I picked this book up not too long ago. Actually, it's a lovely book from Everyman's Library. It's a beautiful book with all his full collected short stories. So I'm going to read this one to you, and this is called A Natural History of the Dead. It has always seemed to me that the war has been omitted as a field for the observations of the naturalist. We have charming and sound accounts of the flora and fauna of Patagonia by the late W.H. Hudson. The Reverend Gilbert White has written most interestingly of the hoopoe on its occasional and not at all common visits to Selborne, and Bishop Stanley has given us a valuable, although popular, family history of birds. Can we not hope to furnish the reader with a few rational and interesting facts about the dead? I hope so. When the persevering traveller Mungo Park was at one period of his course fainting in the vast wilderness of an African desert, naked and alone, considering his days as numbered, and nothing appeared to remain for him to do but to lie down and die, a small moss flower of extraordinary beauty caught his eye. Though the whole plant, says he, was no larger than one of my fingers, I could not contemplate the delicate conformation of its roots, leaves, and capsules without admiration. Can that being who planted, watered, and brought to perfection, in this obscure part of the world, a thing which appears of so small importance, look with unconcern upon the situation and suffering of creatures formed after his own image? Surely not. Reflections like these would not allow me to despair. I started up and, disregarding both hunger and fatigue, travelled forward, assumed that relief was at hand, and I was not disappointed. With a disposition to wander and adore in like manner, as Bishop Stanley says, can any branch of natural history be studied without increasing that faith, love, and hope which we also, every one of us, need in our journey through the wilderness of life? Let us therefore see what inspiration we may derive from the dead. In war, the dead are usually the male of the human species, although this does not hold true with animals, and I have frequently seen dead mares among the horses, as interesting aspect of war too. Is that it is only there that the naturalist has an opportunity to observe the dead of mules. In 20 years of observation in civil life, I have never seen a dead mule and begun to entertain doubts as to whether these animals were really mortal. On rare occasions, I had seen what I took to be dead mules, but on close approach, these always proved to be living creatures who seemed to be dead through their quality of complete repose. But in war, these animals succumb in much the same manner as the more common and less hardy horse. Most of those mules that I saw dead were along mountain roads or lying at the foot of steep declivities whence they had been pushed to rid the road of their encumbrance. They seemed a fitting enough sight in the mountains where one was accustomed to their presence, and looked less incongruous there than they did later at Simnia, where the Greeks broke the legs of all their baggage animals and pushed them off the quay into the shallow waters to drown. The numbers of broken-legged mules and horses drowning in the shallow water called for a Goya to depict them, although, speaking literally, one can hardly say that they called for a Goya since there had only been one Goya, long dead, and it is extremely doubtful if these animals, were they able to call, could for pictorial representation of their plight, but, more likely, would, if they were articulate, call for some one to alleviate their condition. Regarding the sex of the dead, it is a fact that one becomes accustomed to the sight of all the dead being men, that the sight of a dead woman is quite shocking. I first saw inversion of the usual sex of the dead after the explosion of a munition factory which had been situated in the countryside near Milan, Italy. We drove to the scene of the disaster in trucks along poplar, shaded roads, bordered with ditches containing more minute animal life, which I could not clearly observe because of the great clouds of dust raised by the trucks. Arriving where the munition plant had been, some of us were put to patrolling about those large stocks of munitions, which for some reason had not exploded, while others were put at extinguishing a fire which had gotten into the grass of an adjacent field, which task being concluded, we were ordered to search the immediate vicinity and surrounding fields for bodies. We found and carried to an impoverished mortuary a good number of these, and I must admit, frankly, the shock it was to find that these dead were women rather than men. In those days, women had not yet commenced to wear their hair cut short, as they did later several years in Europe and America, and the most disturbing thing, perhaps because it was the most unaccustomed, was the presence, and even more disturbing, the occasional absence of this long hair. I remember that after we had searched quite thoroughly for the complete dead, we collected fragments. Many of these were detached from a heavy barbed wire fence which had surrounded the position of the factory, and from the still existent portions of which we picked many of these detached bits, which illustrated only too well the tremendous energy of high explosive. Many fragments we found a considerable distance away in the fields, they being carried forward by their own weight. On our return to Milan, I recall one or two of us discussing the occurrence and agreeing that the quality of unreality and the fact that there were no wounded did much to rob the disaster of a horror which might have been much greater. Also the fact that it had been so immediate and that the dead were in consequence still as little unpleasant as possible to carry and deal with it made it quite removed from the usual battlefield experience. The pleasant though dusty ride through the beautiful Lombard countryside was also a compensation for the unpleasantness of the duty on our return. While we exchanged expressions, we all agreed that it was indeed fortunate that the fire which broke out just before we arrived had been brought under control as rapidly as it had, and before it had attained any of the seemingly huge stocks of unexploded munitions. We agreed too that the picking up of the fragments had been an extraordinary business, it being amazing that the human body should be blown into pieces which exploded along no atomical lines, but rather divided as capriciously as the fragmentation in the burst of an high explosive shell. A naturalist, to obtain accuracy of observation, may confine himself in his observations to one limited period, and I will take first that following the Austrian offensive of June 1918 in Italy as one in which the dead were present in their greatest numbers. A withdrawal having been forced and an advance later made to recover the ground lost, so that the positions after the battle were the same as before, except for the presence of the dead. Until the dead are buried, they change somewhat in appearance each day, the colour changing Caucasian races from white to yellow-green to black. If left long enough in the heat, the flesh comes to resemble coal tar, especially where it has been broken or torn, and it has quite a visible tar-like iridescence. The dead grow larger each day until sometimes they become quite too big for their uniforms, filling these until they seem blown tight enough to burst. The individual members may increase in girth to an unbelievable extent, and faces fill as taut and globular as balloons. The surprising thing, next to their progressive corpulence, is the amount of paper that is scattered about the dead. Their ultimate position, before they're in any question of burial, depends on the location of the pockets in the uniform. In the Austrian army, these pockets were in the back of the breeches, and the dead, after a short time, all consequently lay on their faces, the two hip pockets pulled out and scattered around them in the grass. All those papers their pockets had contained, the heat, the flies, the indicative positions of the bodies in the grass, and the amount of paper scattered, or the impressions one retains. The smell of a battlefield in hot weather one cannot recall. You can remember that there was such a smell, but nothing ever happens to you to bring it back. It is unlike the smell of a regiment, which may come to you suddenly while riding in the streetcar, and you will look across and see the man who has brought it to you. But the other thing is gone as completely. When you have ever been in love, you remember things that happened, but the sensation cannot be recalled. One wonders what the persevering traveller Mungo Park would have seen on a battlefield in hot weather to restore his confidence. There were always poppies in the wheat in the end of June and in July, and the mulberry trees were in full leaf, and one could see the heat waves rise from the barrels of the guns where the sun struck them through the screens of leaves. The earth was stunned a bright yellow at the edge of holes where mustard gas shells had been, and the average broken house is finer to see than one that has been shelled. But few travellers would take a good full breath of that early summer air and have any such thoughts as Mungo Park about those formed in his own image. The first thing that you found about the dead was that, hit badly enough, they died like animals. Some quickly from a little wound you would not think would kill a rabbit. They died from little wounds as rabbit dies sometimes from three or four small grains of shot that hardly seem to break the skin. Others would die like cats, a skull broken in and an iron in the brain. They lie alive 2 days, like cats that crawl into the coal bin with a bullet in the brain and will not die until you cut their heads off. Maybe cats do not die then. They say they have 9 lives, I do not know. But most men die like animals, not men. I've never seen a natural death, so-called, and so I blamed it on the war, and like the persevering traveller, Mungo Park, knew that there was something else, that always absent something else, and then I saw one. The only natural death I've ever seen, outside loss of blood, which isn't bad, was death from Spanish influenza. In this you drown in mucus, choking, and how you know the patient's dead is at the end he turns out to be a little child again, though with his manly force, and fills the sheets as full as any diaper with one vast, final, yellow cataract that flows and dribbles on after he's gone. So now I want to see the death of myself called humanist, because a persevering traveller like Mungo Park or me lives on, and maybe yet will live to see the actual death of members of this literary sect and watch the noble exits that they make. In my musings as a naturalist, it has occurred to me that while decorum is an excellent thing, some must be indecorous if the race is to be carried on, since the position prescribed for any procreation is indecorous, highly indecorous, and it occurred to me that perhaps this is what these people are, or were, the children of decorous cohabitation. But regardless of how they started, I hope to see the finish of a few, and speculate how worms will try that long. Persevered sterility, with their quaint pamphlets gone to bust, and into footnotes all their lust. While it is perhaps legitimate to deal with these self-designated citizens in a natural history of the dead, even though the designation many mean nothing by the time the work is published, yet it is unfair to other dead, who were not dead in their youth of choice, who own no magazines, many of whom had doubtless never even read a review, that one has seen in the hot weather with a half pint of maggots working their mouths have been. It was not always hot weather for the dead. Much of the time it was the rain that washed them clean when they lay in it, and made the earth soft when they were buried in it, and sometimes then kept on until the earth was mud and washed them out and you had to bury them again. Or in the winter, in the mountains, you had to put them in the snow, and when the snow melted in the spring, someone else had to bury them. They had beautiful burying mounds in the mountains. War in the mountains is the most beautiful of all war. And in one of them, at a place called Pokol, they buried a general who was shot through the head by a sniper. This is where those writers are mistaken who write books called Generals Die in Bed, because this general died in a trench dug in snow, high in the mountains, wearing an alpine hat with an eagle feather in it, and a hole in front you couldn't put your little finger in, and a hole in back you couldn't put your fist in. If it were a small fist, you wanted to put it there, and much blood in the snow. He was a damn fine general, and so was General von Beer, who commanded the Bavarian Alpenkorps troops at the Battle of Corporetto and was killed in his staff corps by an Italian regard as he drove into Udine ahead of his troops. And the titles of all such books should be Generals Usually Die in Bed, if we are to have any sort of accuracy in such things. In the mountains too, sometimes the snow fell on the dead outside the dressing station on the side that was protected by the mountain from any shelling. They carried them into a cave that had been dug into the mountainside before the earth froze. It was in this cave that a man whose head was broken, as a flower pot may be broken, although it was all held together by membranes and a skilfully applied bandage, now soaked and hardened, with the structure of his brain disturbed by a piece of broken steel in it, lay a day, a night, and a day. The stretcher bearers asked the doctor to go in and have a look at him. They saw him each time they made a trip. Even when they did not look at him, they heard him breathing. The doctor's eyes were red and the lips swollen, almost shut from tear gas. He looked at the man twice, once in daylight, once with a flashlight. That too would have made a good etching for Goya, to visit with the flashlight, I mean. After looking at him the second time, the doctor believed the stretcher bearers when they said the soldier was still alive. What do you want me to do about it? He asked. There was nothing they wanted done, but after a while they asked permission to carry him out and lay him with the badly wounded. No, said the doctor, who was busy. What's the matter? Are you afraid of him? We don't like to hear him in there with the dead. Don't listen to him. If you take him out there, you will have to carry him right back in. We wouldn't mind that, Captain Doctor. No, said the doctor. No. Didn't you hear me say no? Why don't you give him an overdose of morphine? Asked an artillery officer who was waiting to have a wound in his arm dressed. Do you think that is the only use I have for morphine? Would you like me to have operate on you without morphine? You have a pistol. Go out and shoot him yourself. He's been shot already, said the officer. If some of you doctors were shot, you'd be different. Thank you very much, said the doctor, waving his forceps in the air. Thank you 1,000 times. What about these eyes? He pointed the forceps at them. How would you like these? Tear gas. We call it lucky if it's tear gas. Because you leave the line, said the doctor. Because you come running here with your tear gas to be evacuated. You rub onions in your eyes. You are beside yourself. I do not notice your insults. You are crazy. The stretcher bearers came in. Captain Doctor, one of them said. Get out of here, said the doctor. They went out. I will shoot the poor fellow, the artillery officer said. I am a humane man. I will not let him suffer. Shoot him then, said the doctor. Shoot him. Assume the responsibility. I will make a report. Wounded shot by Lieutenant of Artillery in first cursing post. Shoot him. Go ahead, shoot him. You are not a human being. My business is to care for the wounded, not to kill them. That is for gentlemen of the artillery. Why don't you care for him then? I have done so. I have done all that can be done. Why don't you send him down on the cable railway? Who are you to ask me questions? Are you my superior officer? Are you in command of this dressing post? Do me the courtesy to answer. The lieutenant of artillery said nothing. The others in the room were all soldiers, and there were no officers present. Answer me, said the doctor, holding the needle up in his forceps. Give me a response. Fuck yourself, said the artillery officer. So, said the doctor, so, you said that. All right. We shall see. The lieutenant of artillery stood up and walked towards him. Fuck yourself, he said. Fuck yourself. Fuck your mother. Fuck your sister. The doctor tossed a saucer full of iodine in his face as he came towards him. Blinded, the lieutenant fumbled for his pistol. The doctor skipped quickly behind him, tripped him, and as he fell to the floor, kicked him several times and picked up the pistol with his rubber gloves in his hands. The lieutenant sat on the floor, holding his good hand to his eyes. I'll kill you, he said. I'll kill you as soon as I can see. I am the boss, said the doctor. All is forgiven, since you know I am the boss. You cannot kill me, because I have your pistol. Sergeant, adjutant. The adjutant is at the cable railway, said the sergeant. Wipe out his officer's eyes with alcohol and water. He has got iodine in them. Bring me the basin to wash my hands. I will take this officer next. You won't touch me. Hold him tight. He is a little delirious. One of the stretcher bearers came in. Captain Doctor, what do you want? The man in the dead house. Get out of here. He's dead. Captain Doctor, I thought you would be glad to know. See, my poor lieutenant, we dispute about nothing. In time of war, we dispute about nothing. Fuck you, said the lieutenant of artillery. He still could not see. You've blinded me. It is nothing, said the doctor. Your eyes will be all right. It is nothing. A dispute about nothing. Aye, suddenly screamed the lieutenant. You have blinded me. You have blinded me. Hold him tight, said the doctor. He is in much pain. Hold him very tight. What a wonderful, detailed description of even who knows whether it were pieces that he'd scenes that he'd pieced together to come up with that, but just absolute. It's like looking through a lens back in time, isn't it? Absolute wonderful, absolute wonderful piece of writing. Blows your mind. Wonderful. It reminds me of a scene in A Bridge Too Far with James Caan with Doctor Intent, very vividly detailed like that, but the roles are reversed in that scene, aren't they? He puts a gun to the doctor's head because the doctor won't take his comrade and his friend who he'd promised that he wouldn't die. He takes him to medics, to doctor, and doctor says just put him there, he's dead. But he's not, story anyway if you've seen A Bridge Too Far. But yeah, thanks ever so much. Wonderful piece of literature by Ernest Hemingway. I thought I'd share that with you. I'll enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.